Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy Elbourn. I am a member of the Angular team, and I'm here today to talk to you about the Angular CDK, or Component Dev Kit. So most of you in the audience are probably familiar with Angular Material. If you're not, this is a project by the Angular team with the aim of building a set of really high-quality UI components based on Google's material design specification, obviously built on Angular. These components are used by many applications, both inside and outside of Google. And we've been working on this project for a little under 2 years now. And in that time, we've built in the neighborhood of 30 material design components. And over the course of this time, we were watching out for common patterns and behaviors shared between multiple components. So to give you an idea of what I mean, we have components for date pickers, notifications, menus, tooltips, autocomplete. All of these components have something in common, which is the need to open up some floating panel on the screen and deal with positioning and what happens when you scroll. We have tabs, and we have separate component where these are both switching between views dynamically in your application at runtime. We have things like side nav and dialog, which have special accessibility requirements, such as being able to trap the focus inside of a particular region of the page while those components are active. And so we've built some common infrastructure for dealing with these repeated patterns, these repeated behaviors. And over time, we came to call the foundation that all of these components are built on, this common infrastructure, the CDK, the Component Development Kit. And you can kind of imagine that if the component library is our rocket ship, the CDK is the set of engine parts that go into building that rocket. Now, we released the initial version of the CDK about 3 months ago in July, the very first beta, and we've been iterating on it since then. So it's available now for people to try out and to give us feedback on. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a high-level idea of what the CDK is, but I want to tell you a bit about why we made it to begin with. Why not just keep working on the material design components as the main thing? Well, first of all, as Brad mentioned in the keynote, we know that not everyone wants that specific material design aesthetic. Every product has its own brand. You may have your own designers, and you just need something different. So we wanted to make the tooling and the work we had done available to as many people as possible so that they could take advantage of this for their own applications. Also, as Brad mentioned during the keynote, that the Angular community has built a ton of amazing component libraries. You don't just have Angular material to choose from. There's a whole bunch of other options. And we wanted to start working on some tooling that a lot of these UI components could use if they wanted to, that they could share so we could collaborate on solving these problems together that keep coming up in component development. We also know that there is no reusable component library that is going to have everything you need forever. Every application has its own specific business needs, its own domain problems that you need to solve, and you're going to end up building reusable components that you're going to use across your own application. And so we wanted to make tools available to make building those components in your application easier so you can focus on what actually matters to your own product success. And lastly, we also discovered that breaking out this foundation into small, focused, reusable modules makes the code easier to reason about and actually helps our own code health. So what's in it? I've been keep talking about this, but I haven't actually told you about what it does. So I'm going to give a quick run-through of some of the packages in the CDK. This isn't comprehensive, but should kind of give you a high-level idea of the things we're trying to capture. So we have an accessibility subpackage that is focused on utilities for making components more accessible, specifically for screen reader users, for things that have to do with managing focus or dealing with ARIA attributes or keyboard shortcuts. We have a module for dealing with BiDi. So this provides a common pattern for components to figure out whether they're in LTR, RTL, and respond to changes in that. We have a layout module that has some helpers for building responsive or adaptive UIs for different screen sizes or dealing with situations where the screen size may change. We have an overlay module, which is the service for creating all kinds of floating panels and pop-ups that deals with all of the positioning, the scrolling behavior, dealing with the LTR RTL setup. We have a platform package for dealing with platform detection or user agent detection. This is really useful in cases where regular feature detection isn't enough because there's some browser quirk. This comes up a lot when dealing with accessibility because screen readers react to different browsers in different ways, and sometimes you just have to know whether you're on WebKit or Blink or Trident. We have a utility called Portal, which is a system for dynamically creating components and views. This is built on top of Angular's existing ng templates and component instantiation utilities. And finally, we have some high-level base components that other components can be built on top of. So as an example, our Angular material data table is built on top of the CDK data table, where the latter has no opinions about styling or display and is only concerned with the pure logic of rendering cells of templated rows. And all of the style that goes on top of that comes from whoever is extending the CDK table to build their own component specific to their use case. So that's the high level of the main things available in the CDK today. But I want to give you a little bit more of an in-depth look at a couple of these pieces. And so to do that, I'm going to go through a quick live demo where I'm going to build a color picker component from scratch. So I'm going to start off. I have a totally empty Angular CLI project. It just has some text on the screen right now. I'm going to zoom that in a little bit more. So doing nothing. All I've done so far is created an empty project with the Angular CLI, and I've installed Angular CDK. So the first thing we're going to do is go to our module here, and we're going to start adding some modules from the CDK. So we're going to add the overlay module and the accessibility module, and we're going to add Angular's common module as well. Then we're going to go to our CSS for the application, and I'm going to add some pre-built styles here that come from the CDK, so importing those from the package. This just has some structural styles that provide no visual styling, no visual CSS, but deal with how things appear on the page, specifically for overlays for things like absolute positioning, z-index, that kind of thing. And then I'm also, while I'm in this CSS file, I'm going to add some styles that are specific to the color picker that I'm going to make. These don't really have anything to do with the CDK. They just make the demo pretty, so you don't have to worry about that. So now we have our setup complete. That's all we needed to do to bring in the CDK is bring in our modules and those styles. And so now we want to just generate our color picker component. I'm going to use the Angular CLI to do that. So I'm just going to say ng for generate, c for component. We're going to call it color picker. And it doesn't have an inline template. And that generates our component. We're going to git add that. So is OK with our IDE. Pop that away. And so now you see we have this color picker in our application. So we're going to open that up. And we have this totally empty color picker component. I'm going to get rid of some of this boilerplate that the Angular CLI added that we're not going to need for this demo. And we're going to grab this selector here, this app color picker, go and replace the contents of our app with that. And now we'll pop back over to our browser, and we've got our color picker component rendering out. So we're ready to go. First thing we're going to do is add some properties to our color picker to drive the interaction. So we're just going to say is open equals false, because we want to pop open a little color picker. So it's going to start off as not open, and we're going to have a selected color. And we're going to start that off as just empty. And the last thing we're going to need some colors to display. So I'm going to add some colors here that I have pre-made. That's just some of the material design palette. So we'll collapse that. All right, templating. We'll get rid of this placeholder text. And we're going to need two parts for our color picker. We're going to need a button to trigger the pop-up and the actual pop-up itself. So we'll start with the button. Add that here. That's our color. And it's going to be a type button, because we don't want to submit a form. And we are going to add a little click handler here just to toggle that panel for whether or not it is open. And we're going to add a little style here for the background color based on our selected color. So selected color or none if we don't have one. So there's our button. We can click it. It's going to toggle is open, but that doesn't do anything because we haven't created the floating panel yet. So let's do that. We're going to create an ng template here. If you saw Alex's talk earlier, you probably got a little exposure to this, but this is creating a template that other directives can use to stamp out content. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to add a directive here. It's called CDK connected overlay. And this is going to turn this template into a floating panel on the screen that's going to be connected to some origin element. So how do we actually connect this to another element? So we have to first go to our button, and we're going to mark it as a CDK overlay origin so that this button can now act as an origin for that overlay. And we're also going to create a template variable assigned to the instance of that origin. So we can then, over here, attach the overlay to that trigger. So now these two things are connected. The only other piece of configuration we need is to say whether or not this panel is open. And we'll just add some placeholder text for now. Come over to our demo. We click the button, and that pop-up shows up. Now, this just looks like text on the screen. This doesn't look like a floating panel. This is because the CDK doesn't have any opinions about styles, and it is leaving that to the component author to decide how their component is actually going to appear. So this is a positioned floating panel on the screen, but there's no styles that make it look that way. So we're going to add some content here to make it look how we want. And this is some pre-made content. Just a quick run-through of this. We're treating the contents of this overlay as a role dialog for accessibility purposes. Inside of that, it's got a list box with a handful of options for each color. And we're just showing the color that is listed from our code. And we have a click handler that is going to change the selected color and close it once we pick one. So we pop back here. And now when we click this button, we get this fancy color picker pop up. I'm actually going to zoom that down a little so it's not so big. And that toggles open and close. We can select a color. All right. So that kind of shows you the basics of the overlay. But there are a few features I want to show off that just that basic use doesn't kind of get across. So I'm going to add some white space here to the beginning and the end of this, just so it makes the page big enough so that I can scroll. So this is scrolling here. I'm going to actually increase that spacing since I'm zoomed in so much. Right? And so now, normally when I open this pop-up, it shows up right underneath. But if I were to open it when this thing is near the bottom of the screen, there's not enough room for that panel to appear. And so I click it here, and the panel shows up above. So this intelligently figures out where in the viewport the overlay would render and will position it accordingly. And it's not only on open. If I scroll, it will reposition and remain in the viewport. The set of positions that this is going to use is totally configurable, but the default behavior is to use kind of this drop-down style behavior. So I'm going to get rid of that white space now, since you saw the fancy repositioning. And I'm going to pop into the index.html, and I'm going to go to my body, and I'm going to add dir RTL to set this to an RTL language. This would be something for like Hebrew or Arabic, and you'll notice that the browser will then automatically put my button on the right side of the screen because the layout now starts on the right. And when I open my overlay, it is going to automatically reposition itself based on the new starting layout direction so that it is right aligned with the origin element as opposed to being on the left. So it knows about your application's LTR RTL state and will adjust itself accordingly. So I'm going to take that away now because I don't want to do the rest of the demo in RTL. OK, so that's everything about the overlay I wanted to show off. But because we're treating this color picker as a dialog, we're going to want to manage the focus for it as well if we want to make an accessible user experience. You'll notice I have all of these roles and ARIA attributes on here, so I care very much about accessibility. So one of the things we need to do if we're using a dialog role is to trap the focus, the browser focus, within that dialog region when it is active on the screen. And we're going to use another directive here, this time from the accessibility package, called CDK trap focus. And what this will do is anytime focus is within this region on the screen, actually put it on the wrong element. Anytime the focus is inside of this region on the screen, you won't be able to tab out of it. And this will prevent people from accidentally moving focus to something underneath the dialog and escaping the workflow they're supposed to be in. I'm also going to add another option to this called CDK Focus Auto Capture, which will make it so that as soon as this region becomes active on the screen, it will move the focus to the appropriate element inside of that region, the first tabbable focusable element. And when that region goes away, it will return focus to wherever it came from. So let's try this out in our demo. I'm going to just use the keyboard. I'll tab to my button. You'll see it has the blue highlight for showing that it's focused. I'll activate that, and you'll see that the focus automatically moved into that overlay when I opened it. And when I press tab, it doesn't go anywhere. It stays right where it's supposed to. If I had more tabbable elements inside of this pane, it would cycle between them. But because I only have the one, it just stays there. So that's great. We're managing our focus the way we're supposed to. The last thing we need to do is add some keyboard shortcuts, because I want to be able to open this and use my arrow keys to move through these options. So I'm going to come back now and use another utility from the accessibility package to add some keyboard shortcuts here. I'm going to start off by adding another directive here to my code. And this is an option directive. I'm just going to match on those existing role option that I already had in the template, so I don't have to add any new selectors. And all this directive does is it toggles a CSS class on whichever option is active based on this isActive property. And we are looking at the class now. We see this implements an interface called highlightable. This is something that is used by the key manager utility we're about to use so that each option knows what it's supposed to do when it becomes active. In this case, we just want to toggle that CSS class, so it's just going to change the property. So now that we've created this color option directive, really quick, we're going to go add it to our ng module so we don't forget that. Bring that in there. And we're going to come back to our original component here, and we're going to add a viewChildren query for those options. We're going to call them options, and that is a query list of options. So we have the options that we care about now. This is where the utility from the CDK comes in. We're going to create a key manager, and specifically an active descendant key manager for these options. There are two types of key managers in the CDK right now, a focus key manager and the active descendant key manager. The latter uses ARIA active descendant to mark which thing is active, and the former uses the browser focus state. So we're going to use the active descendant one here. So we've defined it. Now we just have to initialize it. And we're going to do that in ng after view init, because our options are in our view. And we'll say this dot key manager equals new active descendant key manager, this dot options. So we've initialized it. And the last thing we need to do is create a keydown handler for keyboard events. And we're just going to forward those events to the key manager we created. So keydown, right? So whenever we receive a keyboard event, we just want to forward that event to the key manager and let it do its thing. Come back to the template here, and on our list box here, we're going to add this keydown handler and keydown handler for $event. And that is all we should need to do. If we come back to our demo here, pop that open, I can now use my arrow keys to move through these. And that key manager is totally handling all of this for me. It stops at the end. I don't really like that. So I'm going to come back to my code here, and I'm going to add another option to this key manager. I'm going to say with wrap. So now it will wrap. And come back in here, and I can cycle through. It will wrap around. So there are a couple of different configuration options you can use for this, and it handles all of that logic for you. And so that is, unfortunately, all the time I had today to show this off. So I'm just going to go ahead and commit this, build the whole demo. And I'm going to export. So this demo is now going to be on GitHub for everyone to check out after this talk. I'm going to pop back to my slides. So that's it for my live demo. If you want to see more of the CDK in action, there are a bunch of plunkers linked here on my slides for some of the other features that we have. Thanks to Christian on our Angular material team for putting these together. A little bit about the future work we plan on doing. We want to add more high-level components to the CDK, things like dialogues, SVGs, and listbox interaction patterns for other people to build on top of, because these are very common component patterns. And we also want to add more generic helpers for things like drag and drop, gestures, and Angular directives around browser primitives, such as intersection observer. You can follow our progress on this and see the code on GitHub at GitHub Angular Material 2. And our documentation is on material.angular.io. You can find these slides at g.co/ng-mix17cdk. And the live demo I just pushed to github.com, my personal account, Elbourn, mix17cdk demo. That's all for me, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jeremy.